Welcome, everybody. My name's Kate Holland, and I'm an associate professor of Russian literature at the University of Toronto, and I'm president of the North American Dostoevsky Society. And I'd like to welcome you all to what's now an annual event for our society, which is the graduate research panel, in which we have some new papers with new approaches to the study of Dostoevsky. So I just wanted to say a few words about our organization to start with, in case you're not familiar with it. So the North American Dostoevsky Society is the iteration of the International Dostoevsky Society. We organize a series of different kinds of events. You can see with my colleague Katya Bowers, who's our vice president, has just put into the blog, just put into the chat our blog, the bloggers Karamazov. We have several series going on, including a global Dostoevsky's series on the blog at the moment. We organize a semi-regular lecture series, virtual lecture series. We have several conference panels, including coming up at ACES. We have a roundtable devoted to the memory of one of our past presidents, Deborah Martinson. We have an annual undergraduate and graduate essay competition, and the winner and runner-up of which are going to be presenting on the panel today. And so also wanted to mention our response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, Dostoevsky is a hot topic at the moment, even having been referenced by Putin in a speech last week. So we responded to the invasion right away, and you can see our response here. Let's see. I'm just going to read it out. We said that as scholars and teachers of Dostoevsky's works, we've watched with horror Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And we go on to talk about the way in which Dostoevsky's ideas are, to some extent, implicated in the invasion. But anything else? I think that's about all about the North American Dostoevsky Society. But if you're not already a member, if you're in North America, you can join NADS. If you are in the rest of the world, you can join the International Dostoevsky Society on our website, dostoevsky.org. And we have our triennial Dostoevsky symposium coming up in Japan in the summer, which I'm sure some of you will be attending. Okay, so without further ado, let me pass you over to Dr. Sarah Young. She's going to preside over the first half of the panel. She's an associate professor of Russian at UCL, and she'll introduce the first two presenters, and then I'll return for the second half of the panel and introduce the last two presenters. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks everyone for joining us. So our first paper today is by Fiona Bell, who is a doctoral student at Yale University, and her paper is titled Raskolnikov's Red Nose, the slapstick comedy of a dead serious hero. So over to Fiona.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here, and I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. So today I'd like to begin by asking you all a question. What if, when reading Crime and Punishment, in your mind's eye, you cast Buster Keaton as Raskolnikov? This wouldn't be a stretch. Raskolnikov wears ridiculous clothes. He paces and mutters maniacally in public. He's so uncoordinated that he's often mistaken for a drunkard. A cabbie whips him in the street, and an old woman, taking him for a beggar, gives him money, which he accepts. Besides, he's always overreacting physically, falling over, jumping up, breaking into a run, and collapsing. Today, I will lay out some central devices of slapstick comedy, contrasting this genre with melodrama, the more widely accepted theatrical metaphor for Dostoevsky's prose. I will then demonstrate Dostoevsky's use of the slapstick mode before and during the murder scene in Crime and Punishment, drawing on a paragon of the genre, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, for comparison. In Dostoevsky's novel, the slapstick modality of the murder scene is precisely what motivates the reader's empathetic identification with Raskolnikov. Yet, Dostoevsky complicates this identification when he narrates the unpremeditated murder of Yelizaveta Ivanovna. Here, the writer enters the melodramatic mode, accentuating the woman's fear and depicting Raskolnikov no longer as a clown, but instead as a deft killer. Dostoevsky's intergeneric movement within this scene accomplishes an essential characterization of Raskolnikov, the split which remains salient in the remainder of the novel. Like Dostoevsky himself, I argue, slapstick comedy sits at the nexus of social critique and spirituality. The performance genre is deeply concerned with the absurdity of work under capitalism, and like Orthodox theology, it emphasizes the fallibility of the body and the fallacy of human authority. When we recognize the slapstick in Dostoevsky, we invite these seemingly conflicting sides of his writerly project to coexist. So the term slapstick comes from a prop developed by 16th century commedia dell'arte troupes, two pieces of wood joined at one end that, when hit together, make a loud slapping sound. Like the prop for which it was named, this genre involves the play acting of violence, both intentional, a pie in the face, and unintentional, like slipping on a banana peel. The smallest unit of slapstick is the gag, which could be a fall, a punch, an overreaction, a double take, or a collision, to name a few examples. And here you see a photo from the commedia dell'arte tradition, so I'll come back to this in a moment. The slapstick gag, theoretically speaking, is an unexpected undermining of an apparent purpose, a detouring, if not derailing, of a rational system. The ultimate system under attack in slapstick is capitalism. So on a formal level, gags are often structured as units of labor in which the clown attempts to do a good job and fails spectacularly, or alternately makes comically little attempt to fulfill expectations. So even when clowns aren't literally on the job, like Tramp in Chaplin's Modern Times or Lucy in I Love Lucy, slapstick routines can be read as embodied meditations on working class precarity. Where melodrama enacts crises of individual morality, slapstick enacts large-scale social critiques. And while Dostoevsky is certainly concerned with morality, he does not develop a consistent melodramatic metaphoricity of gesture, as Peter Brooks has termed it. Instead, he indicates the illegibility and semiotic instability of gesture in the human world. So when Sonia asks Raskolnikov to kiss the earth and beg forgiveness at the end of Crime and Punishment, she is requesting a melodramatic gesture. However, when Raskolnikov kneels and kisses the earth, passersby jeer at him and call him a drunkard. This scene of bathos, one of many in Dostoevsky, exemplifies the illegibility of gesture in the slapstick mode. And yet, for all of slapstick semiotic anarchism, its cheeky refusal to signify, I argue that this type of gesture is not carnivalesque in the Bakhtinian sense. For Raskolnikov, slapstick physicality is not playful or regenerative, but involuntary and painful. So now back to this photo that you see. In the early modern commedia dell'arte tradition, the socially lowest character type was the zani, an uneducated migrant worker who was hired by prosperous characters to perform odd jobs. He performed these tasks zealously, but unsuccessfully. At its height between the 16th and 18th centuries, commedia dell'arte coincided with the rise of capitalism in Europe. The zani, historically defined, was an agricultural worker pushed out by land enclosure movements in search of wage labor. In this way, the zani inaugurated the clown's enduring status as a representative of the worker's precarity under capitalism, typified by Tramp in Modern Times, who proves unable to conform to the demands of factory work as the factory deforms him. You can see his body in between the gears. In Cyan Nye's analysis, which ranges from commedia dell'arte to contemporary performance, zaniness, from the word zani, is about a precariousness created specifically by the capitalist organization of work. The zany worker is desperate, stressed, and visibly strained. Within the fictive narrative, they are observed and chastised by some sort of boss, a figure from the propertied class who expects productivity. And while the clown is innocently trying to do a good job, the slapstick viewer may either feel anxiety on their behalf or alternatively pleasure at their anarchic refusal of efficiency. Though slapstick often involves violence against the clown, in a larger sense, it's a slap in the face of bourgeois legibility, rationality, and productivity. Vadim Schneider has recently emphasized this socioeconomic dimension in Dostoevsky's characterizations, noting that most characters in Crime and Punishment spend their time performing odd jobs in the gig economy of post-reform Russia. In fact, we can consider Raskolnikov's socioeconomic precarity as the motor behind his slapstick gesture. Though Raskolnikov does not have a steady job, or perhaps because of this, he often moves like a zani. When he considers taking a freelance translation job from Razumikhin, he enters a frenzy. Without saying a word, Raskolnikov took the pages of the German article, picked up the 3 rubles, and walked out in silence. Razumikhin followed him with his eyes in bewilderment. But after having reached the first line, Raskolnikov suddenly turned around, climbed the stairs back up to Razumikhin's, and placing both the German pages and the 3 rubles down on the table, left again without saying a word. Unlike Oblomov, who can permanently retire to his couch, Raskolnikov experiences the economic pressure that motivates zaniness. In fact, when Raskolnikov visits the police station for the first time, he introduces himself as a poor, sick student, disheartened by poverty. Raskolnikov's own frustration with his socioeconomic position is famously a self-professed motive for the murder of the old pawnbroker woman. Rather than submitting to the demands of the economic system, Raskolnikov attempts to break this system. Simultaneously, he strives to assert his subject status, one that has been thoroughly undermined by the objectifying powers of capital. In Raskolnikov's mind, murder and theft are acts of economic critique, logical alternatives to years of ill-rewarded wage labor, a leap in Ilya Kliger's terms, rather than a long-term progression towards economic stability. So slapstick often lampoons socioeconomic injustice, whether extra-diegetically, as the viewer recognizes the absurdity of capitalist labor, or diegetically, as the clown attempts to cheat the system. The murder plot in Crime and Punishment is a grotesque exaggeration of this clownish tradition. And so, insofar as Raskolnikov's economic positioning has produced in him a zany slapstick physicality, it's possible that even if Raskolnikov didn't really do it for the money, that is capital, made him do it. And what he intends as an efficient shortcut towards socioeconomic prosperity proves to be a tumultuous detour on the path to salvation. If a gag, then, is a detouring, if not a derailing, of a rational system of discourse or action, then the murder scene certainly qualifies as an extended gag in which the desired action, murdering Alyona Ivanovna, stealing the pledges, and leaving no trace, is completed inefficiently. Like a zany clown, Raskolnikov lacks the physical and mental acuity to carry out orders. Whether or not the scene elicits bemusement from its reader, it bears a strange formal tension in which tragic action, murder, is performed with comic gesture. The murder scene itself is composed of a series of smaller gags, or detours. In the slapstick tradition of using exaggerated versions of everyday tools, Raskolnikov chooses an axe as his murder weapon. Apparently, he couldn't rely on a knife, or particularly on his own strength. Therefore, he had settled definitively on an axe. The axe is a less efficient choice, a detour that will require additional preparations. It also undermines Raskolnikov's already fraught subject status. Though the murder is his attempt to assert his subjecthood and autonomy, the hero consciously chooses an object more powerful than he is, an instrument that will instrumentalize him. Raskolnikov's other preparations function similarly, as both gags of unnecessary action and jabs at his subject status. He sews a special loop inside his coat to hold the axe, thus adding an unnecessary step that might have been avoided if he had chosen a more practical weapon. Strangely, Raskolnikov seems to enjoy the preparation process. In his attempts to be crafty, or lovka, he has become quite crafty, not only altering his coat, but also fashioning a fake pledge out of found materials, a wooden block, a metal strip, string, paper, and ribbon. In preparing for an act that will ostensibly fortify his tenuous subject status, along with his masculinity, Raskolnikov becomes a feminized craft hobbyist. Dostoevsky constructs a canonical sexist gag in which the male-identifying clown takes on feminine occupations and performs them poorly, or alternatively, in this case, performs them so well that he undermines his own masculinity. More specifically, Dostoevsky is disrupting the expected hypermasculinity of the criminal, a gag he frequently employs in Notes from the House of the Dead, and one that Chaplin includes in Modern Times, when Tramp's burly jail cellmate takes out his embroidery hoop. Raskolnikov's physicality, too, is a constant source of comedy in this scene. As he walks to Alyona Ivanovna's apartment, the hero exhibits an intensely zany mechanical embodiment, later canonized by Chaplin's Tramp stuck in the gears in Modern Times. Dostoevsky writes, "This last day, which had dawned so unexpectedly and resolved everything all at once, acted on him almost completely mechanically. It was as if someone took him by the hand and pulled him along behind, irresistibly, blindly, with unnatural strength, without resistance. It was exactly as if a corner of his clothes had become enmeshed in the cogwheel of a machine, and it had begun to pull him in." Raskolnikov is conscious here of the battle raging between his zany body and what he considers his steady mind. In the moments before the murder, he attempts to control his erratic physicality, walking quietly and steadily without hurrying so as not to arouse any suspicions, and ringing the pawnbroker's doorbell softly, firmly, without any impatience. He is attempting here to mediate the genre of his crime, attempting for tragic heroism rather than slapstick clownishness. Once in the apartment, however, Raskolnikov is almost completely overcome by zaniness. Struggling against the suspicious Alyona Ivanovna in the doorway, he grabs the door handle with such force that he almost yanked her out onto the landing along with the door. As Raskolnikov prepares to strike the unwitting Alyona, he loses even more bodily control. His hands were terribly weak. He felt how with each moment they grew number and more wooden. In Russian, the verb to go numb is the same as to go mute. So this verb signifies doubly in this scene, emphasizing Raskolnikov's earlier muteness and increasing woodenness, in short, his puppetness. During the first act swing, Raskolnikov is completely disengaged from his body. Hardly aware of himself, and almost with no effort, almost mechanically, he brought the butt end down onto her head. It was as if he had no strength. But as soon as he let the axe fall once, he felt a new strength in himself. Crucially, Raskolnikov feels empowered only when he lets go of the axe, opustil, when the axe functions independently of him. As if a spring has been released in him, Raskolnikov cannot stop attacking. He strikes Alyona Ivanovna twice more, expending extra energy when, for all he knows, the first strike was sufficient to kill her. The great joke of this scene is that Raskolnikov conceives of the murder as a protest of the capitalist labor system, yet the murder itself is a strenuous act of labor. Of all the novel's scenes, he is working the hardest in this one. The hero's ineptness only intensifies as he searches for the hidden pledges. He takes the pawnbroker's keys, runs to her bedroom, and then stops. Another distressing idea suddenly rushed into his head. All of a sudden, it seemed to him that the old woman might still be alive and might revive. This idea hits Udarila Raskolnikov in the head. Here, Dostoevsky portrays Raskolnikov as a victim hit by an idea, just as a clown is bonked on the head by a rubber mallet, or indeed, just as Alyona Ivanovna was struck moments before. Raskolnikov tosses the keys aside and rushes back to the main room to verify that the pawnbroker is dead. He grabs hold of the axe again and raises it above the woman. In this ridiculous position, he realizes that she is dead. The joke resides in Raskolnikov's cognitive inability to recognize death, and again, his overwork in raising the axe now for a fourth time. He then notices a cord on the body and struggles to pull it off, too weak to overpower even an inanimate cord. Exasperated, Raskolnikov thinks of taking the axe to the cord, another nod to the axe's ridiculous oversizedness and the hero's inability to select the correct tool for a given task. Back in Alyona Ivanovna's bedroom, Raskolnikov struggles to find the correct key. He would see, for example, that a key wasn't the right one. It didn't work, but he kept on trying it. When he finally has a new idea, he crawls under the bed. Later, remembering the murder, Raskolnikov recognizes the low, horizontal nature of his crime by recalling this physical position. Would a Napoleon stoop to crawl under an old woman's bed? Hey, what nonsense. We can think of this horizontality as the essential position of the clown, who becomes a clown precisely when he falls. To read Raskolnikov in this scene as a murderous clown, or better yet, a clownish murderer, is perhaps uncomfortable, but it's important to recognize when the slapstick mode begins in order to identify when it ends. As soon as Lizaveta Ivanovna enters the apartment, the genre shifts from slapstick to melodrama. In slapstick, quick pacing leaves no room for emotion or empathetic response for victims of violence. However, during this second encounter, Dostoevsky slows the narrative pace and describes Lizaveta's face in great detail. Dostoevsky also alters Raskolnikov's gesture from a buffoon to an expert killer. When Raskolnikov finally strikes Lizaveta, the blow struck her right on the skull with the blade of the axe. She collapsed onto the floor at once. No longer fumbling, Raskolnikov murders Lizaveta in one strike. The generic mode of the first murder elicits the reader's empathy for Raskolnikov. Laughter at clowns sometimes results not from sadistic amusement at their failings, but rather from identification and concern. Slapstick spectators are anxious to see the clown succeed, experiencing pity or frustration when he fails. By writing the murder scene largely in the slapstick mode, Dostoevsky primes his reader to relate to Raskolnikov as one would relate to a clown, with empathetic and perhaps condescending pity. What is perhaps most twisted is that in eliciting this identification, Dostoevsky manipulates the reader into wanting Raskolnikov to succeed in murder. However, when Raskolnikov kills Lizaveta Ivanovna, he becomes a melodramatic villain. These two Raskolnikovs, the clown and the villain, are yet another manifestation of the hero's essential split personality. Yet Dostoevsky complicates this melodramatic characterization by indicating Raskolnikov's helplessness just a little bit, so something of the objectified clown remains. Because the subject of the sentence in which Lizaveta Ivanovna is killed is the blow, udar, not Raskolnikov himself, the hero paradoxically, grammatically, never strikes. In this critical scene, Dostoevsky imbricates slapstick and melodramatic aesthetics to suggest the complexity of this novelistic hero and his crime. So if, as Carol Emerson argues, Dostoevsky's grisly detail serves the potential for transcendence, then I would add that it does so through the intermediary step of comedy. The detailed description of the murder scene topples the hero's pretensions and emphasizes the banal ugliness of the act. And rather than distancing the reader from the hero, this bathos cues us to react like slapstick viewers, indeed like Orthodox believers, to pity the criminal and desire his escape from an eternity of zany detours. In Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky succeeds in expressing both the claustrophobic predicament of the worker under capitalism and his dearly held theological tenets. His hero's zaniness signals both the dehumanizing effects of capitalism and the indignity of earthly existence. The endings of Crime and Punishment and Chaplin's Modern Times epitomize these simultaneous meanings. So I'll play here the end of this film. Here, Tramp and Ellen, walking cheerfully into the Dust Bowl era American heartland, resemble the spiritually renewed Raskolnikov and Sonia gazing out onto the Siberian expanse. At the end of these works, these Zanni have transcended capitalism, moving beyond the industrialized urban environment into a wide open space where the only overbearing boss is God himself. For the reader with a more collectivist vision of utopia, this ending is perhaps the novel's final joke, and the one joke that Dostoevsky isn't in on. But of course, Dostoevsky never promised utopia. He offers us transcendence, and I, for one, will not begrudge these clowns their happy endings. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for a wonderful paper, and he was a worthy winner of the Dostoevsky Graduate Essay Prize this year. Can I just say that we're going to take questions on all four presentations at the end of the presentations. So if you have questions for the earlier speakers, do make a note of those so that we can come back to them later. We're now moving on to our second paper, which is by Daniel Schwartz, who is a doctoral student at Brandeis University. And his paper is titled, moves on very nicely from the end of the end of Fiona's paper, talking about the epilogue of Crime and Punishment there. His paper is titled An Abrahamic Double Bind, an examination of the possibility of faith in crime and punishment. So over to Daniel.
Hi, thank you very much for having me and organizing this, and thanks to everyone who's here. Okay, I don't have any slides, so I will just begin. What makes what I have done seem to them so monstrous, he asked himself. The fact that it was a crime? What does the word mean? My conscience is easy. Crime and Punishment concludes disturbingly neatly. Is one to believe this epilogue? Can Raskolnikov truly be saved in this unequivocal manner? After all, Dostoevsky concedes that that is another story. Quote, he did not even know that the new life would not be his for nothing, that it must be dearly bought and paid for with great and heroic struggles yet to come. But that is the beginning of a new story, the story of the gradual renewal of a man, of his gradual regeneration, and of his slow progress from one world to another, of how he learned to know a hitherto undreamed of reality. All that might be the subject of a new tale, but our present one is ended. Granted that Raskolnikov's gradual regeneration belongs to a new tale, can we accept that such a tale bears any essential connection to ours? This question has plagued readers and critics since the novel's publication. Altogether rejecting Raskolnikov's redemption, Konstantin Michulsky argued in 1947 that in the epilogue, quote, the final truth about Raskolnikov is suddenly revealed. He is in fact a Superman. He has not been defeated. It is he who has conquered. End quote. Yet Raskolnikov, the tragic hero, the atheist, must be defeated. Quote, there is no freedom other than freedom in Christ. He who does not believe in Christ stands subject to the power of destiny. End quote. Hence, Dostoevsky humbles the unrepentant Raskolnikov by means of a pious lie. In this paper, I argue that Raskolnikov's miraculous transformation is not so much a pious lie as a pious prism through which we are forced to reevaluate his original crime. Only a few pages before the novel's close, Raskolnikov reiterates his view that the first steps of those great men were successfully carried out, and therefore they were right, while mine failed, which means I had no right to permit myself that step. The narrator then steps in severely. This was the sole sense in which he acknowledged his crime, that he had not succeeded and that he had confessed. Raskolnikov remains utterly unrepentant to the very end. Perhaps then his regeneration suggests in a strange way, not penance, not the acceptance and dissolution of his guilt, but that he was never really guilty, that his murder was not unequivocally murder. Kierkegaard writes in Fear and Trembling, quote, the ethical expression for what Abraham did is that he meant to murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he meant to sacrifice Isaac. But precisely in this contradiction is the anxiety that can make a person sleepless. And yet without this anxiety, Abraham is not who he is, end quote. It is on this knife edge that Raskolnikov exists. Recent scholarship has attempted to rehabilitate the epilogue. The trap Dostoevsky sets for us is, curiously, not that of falling for the pious lie, but that of too readily dismissing it. As Robin Miller puts it, quote, the epilogue is perhaps the most subtly, even imperceptibly dialogic and polyphonic text in Dostoevsky's fiction with regard to narrative voices. Eric Naiman, for example, proposes that Svidrigailov's suicide threatens to lull readers into a premature interpretive slumber, that the epilogue thrusts the burden of perverse listening, what he calls adversarial reading, onto us. We have been trained by the novel proper and are now ready, a la Svidrigailov, to, quote, seize on and highlight textual evidence that is there, waiting to be heard in just the wrong way, end quote. Catherine Bowers, by contrast, argues that the epilogue uncannily oscillates between multiple generic possibilities. Quote, generic expectation creates a sense of what ought to happen in a narrative, and when that expectation is thwarted, narrative dissonance can occur, end quote. Crime and Punishment borrows the detective novel narrative structure, shepherding readers into the position of investigator, hungry for, quote, the truth about the crime, the perpetrator, the motive, and the text's central unifying mystery, end quote. Yet the actual mystery is largely absent. We already know the who, what, and why, and it is incompletely projected onto the redemption plot. Is Raskolnikov, can he be redeemed? How might this occur? Miller characterizes this generic uncertainty thus, quote, it is not a whodunit or even a why did he do it, but rather a why did I do it, narrated through the lens of a third-person narrator who is not that I. Does Raskolnikov ever know why he did it? Does Dostoevsky? End quote. If forced to answer, I think we must say no. I wish then to consider this question in a new light by proposing that it cannot be raised without objectivizing and thereby altering the complexion of Raskolnikov's crime in a problematic way. That is, I want first to ask, did he do it? At an initial glance, this question may appear nonsensical. Of course he did it. If that is in doubt, where are we possibly to gain any kind of secure interpretive foothold? Yet, if we take seriously Bakhtin's assertion that, quote, what unfolds in Dostoevsky's works is not a multitude of characters and fates in a single objective world, end quote, then we must wonder, what kind of world is Dostoevsky's? If it is not singular objective, if we are faced with, quote, a plurality of consciousnesses with equal rights and each with its own world, end quote, is murder even possible? Or to put the point less dramatically, does murder retain the same significance in the world of Crime and Punishment as it does in our extra-literary world? This epilogue, Miller observes, offers no smooth exit ramp for the reader from fiction to the real world. The reader remains partially stuck within the space of Dostoevsky's created world, even as she is shepherded back to the everyday reality through a narrative portal composed of the typical language of closure, end quote. What then, if it is not merely representational, is the motivating substratum, the point of Dostoevsky's created world? What is most troubling about the epilogue is the sense that Raskolnikov is redeemed, despite the fact that he does not meaningfully repent. Suppose, however, we excise this despite and assert instead that Raskolnikov is redeemed because he ceases trying to repent. He sheds his guilt completely. Dostoevsky thus stages a conflict between an ethical interpretation of Christianity, a view of Christianity from without, and a religious interpretation of Christianity, a view from within, from which its absolute truth cannot be called into question, only wrestled with viciously and contested subjectively. Through the former lens, Raskolnikov's lack of repentance is shocking, while through the latter, repentance is not needed. I call this an Abrahamic double bind. That God has called upon Abraham to sacrifice Isaac is not in question, yet whether Abraham's act is performed out of faith cannot be established objectively. With respect to Raskolnikov, we must wonder, is this murder genuinely murder, or does it bespeak an insoluble obstacle to representing the night of faith artistically, to bringing this enigmatic, absolute individual to life? Perhaps the movement of faith is irrepresentable, just as Abraham's act is fundamentally inimitable. Susan McReynolds makes a powerful case against the epilogue, carefully establishing the moral untenability of Raskolnikov's awakening. She demonstrates that the kind of utilitarian moral reasoning that the novel consistently rejects is ultimately that on which his redemption is based. Quote, the principle of sacrificial exchange on which the murder is based isn't repudiated. What's repudiated is Raskolnikov's right to practice it. This is the fundamental paradox, I believe, that produces dissatisfaction with the novel. The Christian faith through which Raskolnikov is regenerated does not represent a moral alternative to the sacrificial exchange logic of the murder. It simply represents a renunciation of the individual's right to practice such logic, while conceding this right to higher authorities. Self-sacrifice, McReynolds maintains, is Dostoevsky's most reverenced ideal. The sacrifice of others, by contrast, is repugnant, corroding the human spirit. It is never permissible. The end cannot justify the means. In the Crucifixion, Dostoevsky encounters an incomprehensible conflict between Christ's, quote, transcendent act of self-sacrifice, end quote, and a brutal child-sacrificing father, quote, a bad Jewish utilitarian God whose presence within Christianity is intolerable, end quote. McReynolds argues that Dostoevsky eventually navigates this conflict by transferring the perverse aspects of the crucifixion onto the Jews. In the mature Dostoevsky, then, the good and the bad are irreversibly enmeshed. Quote, anti-Semitic Russian messianism grows in importance to become an essential element of Dostoevsky's heretical Christian faith. The artist, Christian heretic, and anti-Semite become linked. End quote. In order, however, to cling to the moral order at which the novel eats away, we must, to reiterate Bakhtin's point, monologize the novel, treating Dostoevsky's Christian humanism as a stable, self-perpetuating idea that variously slips into and out of contact with human minds, persisting as an inexorable term of criticism, constraining how we are to make sense of the text. But Dostoevsky's text ardently resists this procedure. It is difficult to dispute McReynolds' claim that the novel, quote, unabashedly uses several deaths as the vehicle of Raskolnikov's redemption, end quote, that Porfiry is tasked with drawing this distasteful conclusion when he tells Raskolnikov, this may be God's means for bringing you to him. Yet as we shall see, a vision of faith thus emerges that does not coincide neatly with moral right-doing. There is here a kind of alternative to sacrificial exchange logic, yet it is not straightforwardly a moral alternative. It is toward this murky, paradox-infested terrain that I now direct our attention. Some 20 years before the publication of Crime and Punishment, Kierkegaard examined the contradiction at the heart of Christian faith precisely for its suspension of the ethical. Quote, the single individual is the individual who has his telos in the universal, and it is his ethical task continually to express himself in this, to annul his singularity in order to become the universal. As soon as the single individual asserts himself in his singularity before the universal, he sins. Faith is precisely the paradox that the single individual as the single individual is higher than the universal, is justified before it, not as inferior to it, but as superior. The single individual as the single individual stands in an absolute relation to the absolute, end quote. Faith, then, from a purely ethical point of view, is sinful. To believe is to go beyond the universal, the ethically binding, and to raise oneself into an absolute relation to the absolute. Strictly speaking, this is not sin, if it is faith. Yet intuitively, it is apparent that the passion of faith comes infinitely close to sinfulness. To return to the words I quoted earlier, the ethical expression for what Abraham did is that he meant to murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he meant to sacrifice Isaac. But precisely in this contradiction is the anxiety that can make a person sleepless. And yet without this anxiety, Abraham is not who he is. I do not suggest outright that Raskolnikov is an Abraham, yet Crime and Punishment powerfully ignites this anxiety. God, for Kierkegaard, is absolute insofar as there is an infinite qualitative distinction between God and man. We cannot understand God. What God demands of us is not something that can be approached or put in terms of knowledge. The trouble for both Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, then, is how do we make sense of faith? How, as it were, do we believe in faith in the absence of literal theophany? How, without universalizing and distorting, can we draw a lesson from Abraham? When God's presence is mediated, as of course it must be as in a novel, is faith possible? Can it be adequately represented, rendered outside of the containing subjectivity? This returns us to the singular generic problems faced by Dostoevsky, what Kate Holland describes as, quote, difficulties with representing the redemptive moment in the novel, a secular genre which resists the chaotic time of conversion, end quote. Kierkegaard writes that the paradox of being higher than the universal cannot be mediated, for as soon as Abraham begins to do so, he has to confess that he was in a spiritual trial, and if that is the case, he will never sacrifice Isaac. Or if he did sacrifice Isaac, then in repentance he must come back to the universal. This would appear to be the position of Raskolnikov. He sacrifices the two women and then must repent. But Kierkegaard goes further, preempting repentance. Quote, he gets Isaac back again by virtue of the absurd. Therefore, Abraham is at no time a tragic hero, but is something entirely different, either a murderer or a man of faith. Kierkegaard indefatigably reiterates this point. Abraham believes by virtue of the absurd, and this is where thought founders. At one point, Kierkegaard imagines that Abraham has actually performed the sacrifice, that Isaac's corpse lies before him. Here still, Abraham does not despair or become resigned, does not think to himself grimly that God works in mysterious ways, having deprived him of his beloved son for some unfathomable reason. No, he holds fast to faith. Quote, God could give him a new Isaac, could restore to life the one sacrificed. He had faith by virtue of the absurd, for all human calculations ceased long ago, end quote. Gary Rosenshield stresses the importance of this world, of divine immanence for Dostoevsky. And Abraham's faith, unlike the fanatics, consists precisely in the fact that he does not believe that he is being asked to interfere with life, to destroy finitude for some higher purpose. He is prepared to transgress, but he believes otherwise, that God will restore finitude to him. Abraham does not engage in any kind of self-justification. There is no sacrificial exchange logic. He does not believe that he must sacrifice Isaac, that the reward for demonstrating his faith will justify the action. He does not even believe that he is justified. No point of contact between what this is a quote from Kierkegaard. No point of contact between what Abraham did and the universal can be found other than that Abraham transgressed it, end quote. What Abraham believes is this. By virtue of the absurd, he will keep Isaac. He will sacrifice Isaac, and he will therefore get Isaac back. Here, then, is one way to make sense of Bakhtin's claim that Dostoevsky's world is not a single objective world. It contains this Abrahamic double meaning. Raskolnikov's deed vacillates continually between two possible interpretations. Religiously, it is sacrifice. Ethically, it is murder. After his dream of the murdered horse, Raskolnikov cries out, Lord, he prayed, show me the way that I may renounce this accursed fantasy of mine. Raskolnikov is looking for a way out, yet to abandon his fantasy is both to spare the women, to remain in the ethical, and to renounce God, what is highest and absolute in life. Raskolnikov's atrocity can thus be understood as a magnification of this intolerable conflict. Raskolnikov begs God to release him. Accordingly, we might say, if there is God, everything is permitted. If only there were no God, we could be good. And yet, certainly this is murder. There is little to suggest prior to the epilogue that Raskolnikov succeeds on any interpretation of what he has done. Stultified by despair, Raskolnikov cannot believe, and so he is forced to act. Quote, it was clear that now the time had come, not to languish in passive suffering, arguing that his problems were insoluble, but to act at once and with speed, end quote. Like countless other Dostoevskian protagonists, Raskolnikov cannot dwell in himself peaceably. He must act or succumb to violent spite. One feels also, however, that Raskolnikov must go through with the murder for other, narratological reasons too. Quote, it was as if a part of his clothing had been caught in the wheel of a machine, and he was being dragged into it. In his final meeting with Raskolnikov, Porfiry performs a kind of surrogate confession, continually telling Raskolnikov, I'm not a monster, conveying in a profound way that Raskolnikov is not a monster, that Porfiry sees his monstrousness otherwise, that he is willing to suspend the ethical on Raskolnikov's behalf. That is to say, for Porfiry to understand Raskolnikov and to bring Raskolnikov to recognize himself as the author of his terrible deed, shattering his absolute isolation, guilt must be removed from the picture. Here is Porfiry. I came to clear the matter up, so to speak. I consider it my bounden duty. I want to lay bare the whole thing down to the foundations about what happened, the whole story of that so to speak, darkening of counsel. I made you go through a great deal, Rodion Romanovich. I'm not a monster. I can understand what it must be for a man like you to have brought all this on himself, a man oppressed with cares, but proud, imperious, and in particular, impatient of wrong. This is the first suggestion that it is possible to lay bare the whole thing down to the foundations. Up to this point, the murder has been largely foundationless, leading only to fever dreams, tangential plot lines, and Raskolnikov's self-mystifying paroxysms of loathing and self-loathing. Now, however, the murder is at last examined with perspicuity, level-headedly. Significantly, this is not done by the narrator, but by Porphyry, in what he describes as only a theory, a speculative, merely psychological exercise. One begins to suspect that though we have seen the crime, that at least we feel has been given to us omnisciently, even so, we cannot know or approach it in this omniscient manner. What we have witnessed is immediately snatched away, retracted, like a piece of inadmissible evidence. The narrator is no more than one of the myriad interwoven perspectives that coagulate around the crime. As readers, then, the best we can do is listen to Porphyry, weigh the evidence alongside him. And yet there is something preposterous about this. Don't we, of course, know better than Porphyry, who did not witness the crime, what really happened? One feels that Porphyry means what he says, I'm not a monster, in a strange way, as though he really might be a monster, and is earnestly imploring Raskolnikov and us to believe otherwise. The time for stratagems and manipulation has passed. Quote, oh, stop that. What are methods to me now? You can see for yourself that I didn't come here to start you and catch you like a hare. Confess or don't confess. It's all the same to me now. I am convinced in my own mind without that. And yet moments later, Porphyry begins to muse. Oh, who says I am convinced? For the time being, all this is just my dream. We find here in Porphyry's attitude toward Raskolnikov another instance of Abrahamic doubleness. Porphyry knows in a private way that Raskolnikov is guilty, yet something is missing. Language becomes like filigree, too delicate to arrest, to fix in some final form what is or is not being confessed. The confession continues to slip through the words crime, guilt, justice, until Raskolnikov's only available option is to take respite in, to, like Mikolka, lustfully embrace suffering, whose meaning one cannot evade for long. Abraham, Raskolnikov, is either a murderer or a man of faith. Yet it is the very proximity to faith that deprives the Abrahamic individual of ethical justification. After Raskolnikov's aborted confession in the Haymarket, his two victims all but vanish from his consciousness. His awakening involves no substantive engagement with his crime, but a kind of miraculous transformation of it into unreality. And what were all the torments of the past, everything, even his crime, even his sentence and his exile, seem to him now, in the first rush of emotion, to be something external and strange, as if it had not happened to him at all. Very well, one would like to reply, perhaps your past is no longer quite real, but your crime certainly did happen to Elena and Lizaveta. Raskolnikov's plunge into undreamed of reality is a far cry from believing by virtue of the absurd that what he has done, he has not done, that God will not let it be so. Raskolnikov is a murderer, and indeed a monstrous one at that. And yet Porphyry's words, I'm not a monster, stay ringing in our ears. Raskolnikov is not a monster, we continue wanting to believe, if only he could have reassured us of this himself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Two wonderful talks. Next, our next paper is presented by Laura Hart, who has just graduated from a PhD at University College London. Well done, Laura. Congratulations. And her PhD thesis was entitled Madness in 19th Century Russian Literature, Identity, Self and Other. And today she's going to be presenting the paper, The Divine and the Demonic, Epilepsy, Identity and Power in Brandeis University.
Hi, I'll just get the slides and then I'll start.
Oh, those slides didn't show up.
1 second. Are they
Sure.
showing now?
It says you've started screen sharing, so you might need to just see. Did you click? Yeah, there we go. That's perfect. Yeah. Now you just need to do the slideshow option.
Sorry, I'm not the most. If I switch now to the paper, can you still see the slides?
Yep,
Okay.
we can still see the slides. Yeah.
Thank you. My paper is entitled The Divine and the Demonic Epilepsy, Identity and Power in Ivan Karamazov. This paper will address the question of epilepsy and selfhood in Dostoevsky, focusing on how the portrayal of Smerdiakov in Ivan Karamazov highlights the duality of self. I will consider Dostoevsky's exploration of morality through the use of a composite character with Smerdiakov and Ivan through the lens of the psychologist William James's The Principles of Psychology. Although by the mid-19th century, clinical understandings of epilepsy had developed significantly, the line between the physical disease and madness was still unclear, as in the early 19th century, neuroses encompassed epilepsy and insanity. Seizures and a loss of consciousness were the defining characteristics of epilepsy, but they were also often combined with the mad elements of neuroses and diagnosis. The connection between a disease and a person's mental state has existed throughout history, as the idea of illness as a metaphor was present with several diseases, including tuberculosis, as sufferers were sent to a sanatorium, a word for a clinic for tuberculosis and the most common euphemism for the insane asylum. Before diseases were fully understood, it was common practice to view them as a consequence of a disturbed mental state, and this connection continued in literature as disease metaphors are used to judge society not as out of balance, but as repressive. The religious aspect of epilepsy, both divine and demonic connotations, are present in Dostoevsky's work, as he foregrounds this ambiguity by playing with the conscious and unconscious, demonic and divine elements. Smerdiakov is one such character where this connection to the otherworldly, and the demonic in particular, is made explicit. Smerdiakov is connected to the demonic from his origin. He was born in a bathhouse, which Russian folklore denotes as a place of otherworldly magic, specifically the demonic, whence evil creatures emerge. As with other epileptics in Dostoevsky's fictions, such as Murina Khazyaika and Smerdiakov's depiction is fragmented, and we are only permitted a partial view of him. In Idiot, Dostoevsky allows epilepsy to affect not only his protagonist, but also the novel structure. As Elizabeth Dalton argues, Dostoevsky uses an epileptoid structure, building tension which is then followed by release, and often a lapse of consciousness in the narrative. In relation to Smerdiakov, his flitting in and out of society when it's convenient for him mimics this in and out of consciousness of the epileptic in a social dynamic in the same way that the in and out of consciousness mirrors the fragmented identity. Smerdiakov is a bastard conceived by rape and born to a lowly woman, Yuritiva Elizaveta Smerdiasha, and although many believe his father to be Fyodor Pavlovich, he is denied the certainty of an acknowledged father. His lineage is confirmed neither by the narrator nor by Fyodor Pavlovich himself, despite his adopting the boy as a servant and giving him his patronymic Fyodorovich. The adoption of the child via the patronymic is encountered by the rejection of his surname. Smerdiakov himself purposely obscures his character. There is no attempt to justify or explain his actions, even when they appear shocking to the reader, such as killing cats or being ungrateful to those who care for him. Smerdiakov does not readily give any information about himself, forcing us to view him as an enigma. The reader only comes to understand Smerdiakov's mind, his thoughts and feelings, once they are illuminated in relation to another. For Smerdiakov, this other is Ivan. Ivan, a legitimate son of Fyodor Pavlovich, becomes increasingly marked as Smerdiakov's double throughout the novel, and eventually becomes linked to him through a shared morality. This morality, at its core, can be stated as...
Sorry, Laura, do you mind if I just interrupt you just because we see a black box in front of the slides and we don't see them advancing? I'm not sure if you're advancing them. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
So yeah,
There's still a black box.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Is it still black for you?
Maybe
still
share
black.
and reshare. Sometimes that helps.
Say that again, sorry?
Maybe just unshare and then reshare. Sometimes that helps.
Okay, thank you. Let's try it again.
We won't waste too much time if we can't get it to work, but
it's fine. It's just a few quotes and a couple of pictures.
Okay, no problem.
Is it still?
Looks good now.
Okay, yep. try that again. Okay. This morality at its core can be stated as surface-born. As a result, anyone who does not believe in God or the afterlife, according to Ivan, would find evil permissible. Despite these claims, Ivan does nothing particularly out of the ordinary, and this is where Smerdiakov becomes Ivan's acting moral self. In the Principles of Psychology, philosopher and psychologist William James separates identity into two halves, the ego and the material self. The pure ego, he argues, is the thinking core of the self, the driving force behind all actions, while the material self consists of the social, material, and spiritual. In relation to Ivan and Smerdiakov, with Smerdiakov claiming to be Ivan, subject to Ivan's will, the reader can see how Ivan could be identified as a thinking ego and Smerdiakov as the acting material self. James states that the material self is carried on directly through our desire to please and attract notice and admiration, our emulation and jealousy, our love of glory, influence, and power, and indirectly through whichever of the material-seeking impulses proves serviceable as means to social ends. Looking first beyond the specific connection to Ivan, the qualities of the material self that James identifies can be seen in Smerdiakov when he spends his salary from Fyodor Pavlovich entirely on material goods. He desires not to remove himself from the situation, get married, or improve his living conditions, but simply rather to be seen as more appealing. I would also argue that power is a significant part of Smerdiakov's self. Something that he revels in is his ability to manipulate others into doing as he wishes. For example, Smerdiakov is the only person that Fyodor Pavlovich trusts and listens to his every suggestion, such as hiding money in different places. Fyodor Pavlovich himself appears unaware of this power dynamic, which only increases Smerdiakov's hold over him. Additionally, Smerdiakov is able to set Dmitry up as the murderer in the eyes of the town, suggesting that he holds a certain power over the entire population. His manipulative ways are hidden behind cleverly chosen words and calculated actions, essentially forcing the town to accept certain beliefs emanating from Smerdiakov. However, the genius lies in the fact that the power is not explicit. In fact, it is the opposite. Smerdiakov is only a servant and is seen as fundamentally lacking power. It is from this deception that Smerdiakov's demonic epileptic role comes to the foreground as he plays the town like puppets, reconfiguring the sense of morality in the novel. That effect of morality is most apparent in the dialogue between the two half-brothers before the murder, which suggests that Ivan is aware that something bad will happen and that there is a possibility that his father will be killed, but nonetheless he does nothing to stop it or question it. As Bakhtin states, through Smerdiakov, Ivan's internal rejoinder is transformed from desire into a deed, and the conversation between the two is actually between Smerdiakov's open and conscious will, encoded in hints, and Ivan's hidden will, hidden even from himself. He eventually gives his implicit consent, which causes contention over the question of responsibility. Whether the reader views Smerdiakov not as a double of Ivan or as his demonic half, they are linked together in the death of the father. The two older brothers, Dmitry and Alyosha, also express their desire to kill their father, although Alyosha less directly, but neither accepts Ivan's philosophy as all is permitted. They recognize their inability to reconcile the desire with the morality of their society as intentions as much as actions constitute guilt. Smerdiakov indicates that it does not matter if Ivan believes himself to be guilty or not, as the maxim, everyone is guilty for everything, is relevant here. This echoes the novel's overriding moral message of shared responsibility. The division of identity, broken down into good and evil parts, recalls the representation of epilepsy in another of Dostoevsky's work, Khozyaika, in which the epileptic character Murin encompasses the evil side, while his companion Katerina poses the good, again with an ambiguous play of power underlying their relationship. Unlike the third character in Khozyaika, Ordinov, Ivan does not share in Smerdiakov's epilepsy, but the disease still plays a vital part in uniting them. Without Smerdiakov's epilepsy and fake seizures, the murder based on the morality which unites them may have not been possible. Ivan delegates the role of evil half to Smerdiakov while accusing him of being the true murderer, thereby leaving himself to be the good half, absolving himself of any responsibility, just like Katerina does to Murin. Smerdiakov, however, refuses to validate Ivan's deflection of guilt. forcing him to recognize the mantra that everyone is guilty of everything. The doubling here and shared responsibility for the murder unites them as one rather than as two distinctive halves, and both are evil in this sense. Otto Rank's psychoanalytic study of doubles perfectly describes Smerdiakov as the evil double of Ivan when he states that the most prominent symptom of the forms which the double takes is a powerful consciousness of guilt, which forces the hero no longer to accept the responsibility for certain actions of his ego, but to place it upon another ego, a double, who is either personified by the devil himself or is created by making a diabolical pact. This detached personification of instincts and desire, which were once felt to be acceptable, can be satisfied without responsibility in this indirect way. Viewing Smerdiakov as the demonic double allows Ivan to shift the responsibility for his murderous desires, underlining the importance of shared morality in the novel, or shared responsibility in the novel. Bakhtin highlights the connection between Ivan and his double Smerdiakov when he states that Smerdiakov gradually gains control over that voice of Ivan's, which Ivan is hiding from his own self, unearthing Ivan's desire for the murder to occur as an inevitability of fate, not only apart from his will, but in opposition to him. The demonic double both confronts Ivan with the evil side of himself and enables him to conceal the evil he wishes to perpetrate. Epilepsy here also contributes directly to the plotting of Smerdiakov as evil. It helps him carry out the murder when he fakes seizures for an alibi. The idea of Smerdiakov as an evil double is further strengthened by the appearance of Ivan's hallucinatory double after Smerdiakov's suicide. Just as earlier in the novel, Ivan rejected the idea of God, so too does he now reject the idea of evil and of the devil, claiming that man created the devil in his own image. The devil appears to Ivan just after Smerdiakov's suicide, suggesting that Smerdiakov and the devil are also doubles. Ivan cannot escape this demonic companion. Just as man creates the devil in his own image, so did Ivan's morality develop the image of Smerdiakov as evil. Ivan created Smerdiakov the murderer with his own philosophy. The idea of Smerdiakov as a devil Ivan also appears to be confirmed in this scene when Ivan exclaims that Smerdiakov is the nastiest and stupidest side of himself. In talking to the hallucination of a devil, Ivan refers to it as his evil side, the role to which he also condemns Smerdiakov in place of recognizing his own guilt. Consequently, the devil is connected to the evil side of Ivan, just as with Smerdiakov. They are a part of Ivan that he does not wish to acknowledge. So, to quote Bakhtin, all the loopholes in Ivan's thoughts, all his attempts to get round the other's words and to replace them in his soul with an affirmation of his own self, all the reservations of his conscience that serve to interrupt his every thought, his every word and experience, condense and thicken here into the completed replies of the devil. Ivan's words and the devil's replies do not differ in content, but only in tone, only in accent. The devil, as it were, transfers to the main clause what had been to Ivan merely a subordinate clause. Just as Smerdiakov reveals Ivan's hidden desires, his true nature, so too does the conversation with the hallucinatory devil repeat Ivan's thoughts back to him. He expresses and embodies Ivan's self-consciousness. Looking at Smerdiakov and Ivan through the prism of James's theory allows the reader to understand them as two halves of a whole self, the thinking and the acting self. Smerdiakov's indefinite identity lacks the calculating, thinking, concrete ego that Ivan embodies for him, and he's relegated to the acting material self. Ivan constitutes the I for myself through the ego, and Smerdiakov the I for another through action. Smerdiakov's power over another, killing cats, getting taken care of by Grigoriev, Fyodor Pavlovich paying his tuition, and so on, renders him as the acting self when given directions by his ego, Ivan. This power over another is once again asserted over Fyodor Pavlovich, such as using tricks to manipulate him into acting as desired in order to kill him. Seeing how the two are linked in James's theory shows how deflection of guilt is futile for both Ivan and Smerdiakov. Ivan cannot simply use his perception of Smerdiakov as evil to rid himself of his sin, as Katerina does with Nureddin Hasiaika. Instead, his attempt to do so results in proliferation, as the devil appears in Smerdiakov's place. Smerdiakov is one such example of how the epileptic flits in and out of both society, mirroring the in and out of consciousness of the epileptic, and underlying their fragmentation. Demonic epileptic here is used as a scapegoat for the questionable moral acts of others, and it is precisely their fragmentation that allows them to fulfill this role. The epileptic, whose identity is uncertain, asserts themselves through another, taking on the role of either a demonic or divine or demonic figure based on how they entwine themselves with another. They are unable to determine their impact on the world themselves, but simply act as a moral mirror, forcing the other to be accountable for their actions and desires. Thanks.
Thank you so much for a great paper. And our final paper today is going to be given by Anya Tropnikova, who is a doctoral student in Slavic and film from Yale University. And her paper is entitled Voyeurism and Abjection in Fyodor Dostoevsky's White Nights.
Thank you very much. I am just going to share my screen here and give me just one moment. Everyone can see this, right? Let me just play. Okay.
Looks good, thanks.
Thank you. Okay. I'll begin with an epitaph where Yulia Kristeva says, I spit myself out, I eject myself in the same movement by which I claims to be me. This is going to be the motivirovka, the motivation for the rest of my paper. So at the outset of his literary career, Fyodor Dostoevsky writes a curious, simple, sentimental love story called The White Nights, or Белые ночи. A lonely bachelor wanders city streets during St. Petersburg's famous brightly lit northerly summer nights, without rest and without company. He looks into the facades of buildings, anthropomorphizing and imagining them friends. Human analogues are distinctly missing, except to serve as proof that other subjects exist here, and their suffering is just the same. At a profound estrangement and alienation from his fellow man, he starts attaining friendships with objects, taking the painting of his favorite building, for example, as a personal attack, imagining that the structure beseeches the narrator to help it, having it call to him like an old friend. Ah, they paint me into yellow paint, he says. To a contemporary reader, this misplaced identification with objects doesn't feel too strange. We remember watching and even crying in sympathy with roles like Robin Williams in Castaway, for example, directed by Robert Zemeckis in 2000, when a stranded airline passenger on a deserted island loses his only friend, the volleyball Wilson. One may think back to Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, also in 1954, where wheelchair-bound L.B. Jeffries constructs stories out of the buildings in the courtyard behind his own Manhattan apartment's portholes. The objects of his gaze attaining greater and greater significance for his life, more so even than his job or girlfriend, and the latter two only becoming real through their incorporation into the story of the courtyard's affairs. Turning the corner of the third decade of the 21st century, not a soul can forget the years they spent in isolation staring at flat surfaces, walls, screens, paint jobs, the screen right now, while sheltering from a pandemic. In the United States, more than 1 in 4 people live alone. In big cities, that percentage is much higher. I'm quoting an essay on the epidemic of loneliness that came out from the New Yorker in March 2020. Japan, a nation already notorious for an epidemic of loneliness thanks to its overworked culture, watched a startling statistic unfold as a consequence of the new and highly rigorous pandemic restrictions, where lockdown increased its suicide for young women each month for 12 consecutive months. A generous dose of presentism seemed to have journalists and academics scurrying to show how there is something specifically post-media, post-video game, post-internet, post-etc. that generates an epidemic of loneliness and its alleged effects, including and especially suicide, school shootings, drug overdoses. It is almost standard to expect to see the biography of a lone wolf type of individual whenever a broadcast of a news event announces another Sandy Hook or Uvalde, especially true in the United States, I would say. Yet Dostoevsky's essay, written at 16 for the author, and exactly the critical time for lonely at-risk youth, is revealing for more than just its import for the Russian author's later literary output or its political implications. It suggests that the epidemic of loneliness, vitriol born of alienation and estrangement, projectile vomited by our own era's radicalized youth into online message boards, before some take more drastic measures, actually has precedent extending far beyond our own era's media phenomenon. Thanks to rigorous biographical scholarship on Dostoevsky, we can note that the production of this story is indeed linked to a special time of estrangements in the author's young life, just as Yulia Kristeva has her exile from native Bulgaria to thank for the explication of her concept of exile and abjection. The coping mechanisms constructed by Dostoevsky's narrator feeling in exile, looking in on normal human relationships, calm Hitchcock's Rear Window, right, can be traced and verified in works too numerous to count. There are too many. I'm not going to tabulate them here. But I'll focus on only one film moment and one author that I find particularly relevant. Both presences will serve us, I think, in pointing to how the coping mechanisms for an epidemic of loneliness are as present and more perfect with us now as they were in Dostoevsky's time. White Nights, with its narrator in domiciled exile, inventing imaginary friends, buildings, and I argue also his love interest, Nastyanka, presages David Fincher's adaptation of Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club in 1999 with its IKEA-coveting, bomb-building, disease-feigning, insomniac narrator played by Edward Norton, as well as the bulk of Vladimir Nabokov's literary output, who wrote multiple novels about exiled, voyeuristic characters unable to construct genuine human connection while vociferously disavowing himself from Dostoevsky, like Palahniuk's unnamed narrator from his own alter ego, Tyler Durden. So it's almost as if in the vociferous castigating of Dostoevsky, Nabokov actually confirms his own affinity with this precursor to his own writing. Considering Kristeva's notion of the exile's urge to abject, we can infer that these imagination games and coping mechanisms serve as catharsis. So, according to Yulia Kristeva, the abject only shares one quality with the object, as configured in the Kantian sense of subject and object. It is that of being opposed to I. There is, in abjection, one of those violent and obscure revolts, she says, of being that which threatens it and which seems to come from an outside. This spasm, this leap, is attracted towards an elsewhere, as much tempting it as it is condemned. Tirelessly, like a wild boomerang, a pull of attraction and repulsion draws the one inhabited literally out of himself. It is that which perturbs an identity, a system, an order. The liar, the criminal with a good conscience, the rapist without scruple, the killer who claims to save. An imaginary strangeness and menace that is real. It calls to us this word, fear, abject, a fluid mist, an ungraspable clamminess. Scarcely has it come into being than it blurs like a mirage all the words of language, impregnating them with inexistence in a phantasmatic and hallucinatory glimmer. The one through whom the object exists is thus an outcast who places is placed, separates is separated, situates is situated, and therefore wanders instead of recognizing himself, desiring, belonging, or refusing. From this passage extraction, what should become readily apparent, I think, is on the one hand why I chose to use Kristeva as my lens for approaching this story, and on the other, that modernity itself is pregnant with alienation. The cause of that alienation has been treated better elsewhere, but probably most compellingly by Peter Brook's melodramatic imagination from 1976, which deals with the idea of a loss of a collective myth-making and his idea that pre-modernity, a sense of community, was fostered around a unified collective myth that wedded the nation state and religion. Here we point to even the aesthetic atmosphere that is employed by Kristeva in her description of the abject. From the ungraspable clamminess to the perturbation caused in the unnamed narrator's solipsistic system of St. Petersburg when the hapless citizens decide to vacation to their dachas, the abjection impulse is all over the White Nights. Its clamminess and mist can be found on Night 3, when the narrator recalls how his recently acquired love interest, Nastyanka, as if by magic, knew on Night 2 that it is precisely a foggy night that will come on what should be Night 3, and warning that if there will be rain, we won't see each other, I won't come. But how could she have known that it would rain? This is the first moment of many where Dostoevsky leaves clues that Nastyanka is just a specter created out of profound loneliness, a Wilson the narrator invents out of alienation from his fellow man. I may have yet to find a single analysis of White Nights where it is explicitly tested whether Nastyanka may be nothing more than a figment of narrator's imagination. And I haven't found any, actually. There have been countless realness debates of realness around this, just as other works by Dostoevsky, typical of 19th century literary scholarship. So for example, take the representative sample of Gary Saul Morrison's, of the double, right? And his consideration how genuine compassion might be in the double. Is there some way I can experience the experience of others? He says. When we empathize with others, do we sense rather than just guess at what they feel? So this line of inquiry assumes that others exist. It establishes that the double's characters were real people, a dubious axiom for a story which culminates with the eventual admission of the main character Galyatkin to an asylum. Again, Tyler Durden, Edward Norton-esque, right? To Morrison's credit, in the essay, he'll eventually tackle how identity is rocked by the splitting personalities of Galyatkin Sr. And the experiences he at once undergoes after a complete breakdown from having to deal with his Ubermenschian better counterpart Galyatkin Jr. But Morrison doesn't quite go far enough, doesn't quite equate it with the climactic moment David Finch's narrator Jack discovers that he and Tyler Durden are one and the same. So we have to stress here that the double couldn't be more obvious in explicitly describing abjection, right? It is a story entirely around the creation of an alter ego of the self in order to enable this catharsis of self-flagellation for the exile, soothing the spasm, aligning one's own index finger with the multiple that seem to point to the narrator from his perspective, from his surrounding peers, an exile fashioned not from actually being a foreigner, but from the alienation felt from the narrator's own immediate milieu, or cividad. What about White Nights, the story published 5 years after Dostoevsky experienced exactly this kind of estrangement from fellow man while serving as an officer among St. Petersburg engineering brigadier? Things are somewhat more enlightened in the Russian criticism side of affairs, I would say. So for example, we have Kirpichnikov, who says it's unwise to count the author as the realist of plain type, a simple observer of life. He takes not middling people, but special people, precisely unhappy and forgotten, and simultaneously those with the most refined spiritual organization, or самые тонкие душевные организации. Except for the people whose presence is necessary to serve as the мотивировка, Shkolskian term, for the plot's proceedings, Matriona, and the returning groom that will make Nastinka's physical form disappear. Kirpichnikov is right to point out that both main characters in the story are these special kind of people, right? But their idiosyncrasies are too similar, and in fact, they are very much the same. The diegetic insistence on the realness of the interactions between the narrator and Nastinka are dog whistling for the conscious reader, a wink from the Shalostny author. As far as this kind of mischievous and Shalostny personality is concerned, of course, Dostoevsky has his inspiration in the figure of Alexander Pushkin, whom he made a prophet for contemporaneity. Monika Greenleaf puts it best when she says that what Pushkin readers were reacting to was the contrast between Pushkin's authorial heterogeneity and the romantic adherence to a single lyrical hero, an autobiographical voice or persona. Inconsistencies were then simultaneously being suppressed, ambiguities too easily clarified, all in an effort to make this lyrical hero appear contiguous and not fragmentary. And of course, Monika Greenleaf has an entire work on the fragment in Pushkin. So this was a very conscious kind of gesture, and I argue here Dostoevsky is also doing this conscious kind of gesture. That's a little side note. I have a distinct hunch that the unreliable narrator Nabokov will become famous for was here in Russian literature all along. Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Nabokov, and present in this short story. Its shape and title are further clues. Gary Rosenshield noticed that though it is presented as a confession in diary form, the subtitle insists it is actually a reminiscence. Note that this structure is evocative of exactly the kind that will be used for Nabokov's 1955 Lolita, where Humbert Humbert also presents his confession as a reminiscence, routinely standing outside of his own self and assuming the role of his own most critical judge. In The White Nights, the narrator follows his impulse to abject and align himself with the fingers he imagines are already pointing at him, pointing to himself as a castigated other. He relates to our fictional Nastinka, a figure that he finds most deplorable, that is, himself as the dreamer, as Mechtatel, finding it too difficult to talk about him in the first person pronoun, and asking her explicitly to bear with him as he continues an uninterrupted monologue in third person. So we can see the exact relevant passage here on the slide. Let's evaluate more evidence that Nastenka is entirely creation of the narrator's mind. First, she never asks for our unnamed protagonist's name, even while pausing the natural course of conversation on night 2 to call out the fact that they spent all this time together and still don't know those names. Nastenka then proceeds to introduce herself, but only herself, and she never seems perturbed that the narrator doesn't give his name in return and never asks. Her entire reason for mentioning not knowing each other's names seems to just be a pretense to introduce a klichka for the narrator's love object to the reader, so that the narrator could pause to relish playing with the name on his tongue, just like Humbert Humbert on the first page of Lolita, endlessly playing with the name, repeating it, oh Lolita, oh Lola, oh Nastenka, so that he can call her immediately by this familiar form as well, a truly unlikely event to occur for two strangers from high society who are supposed to have just met each other for the first time. Sorry, disregard. Next, pay special attention to the fact that Bozhe moi, the Russian exclamation of my God, right, is found with the same frequency as in the mouth of Nastenka as that of the narrator and all throughout the text. And then finally, there's the unbelievableness of Nastenka herself. Except for the first interruption to verify that the dreamer and the present narrator are one and the same person, she waits silently and listens during the monologue of night 2, as if a modern day escort hired specifically for the purpose to listening to a lonely person. I'm thinking of Japan's cattle cafes here, actually. She's at once peasant and simultaneously conversant with all of the canon of Western literature. Abreast of the multiple references to various Western canons, the narrator feels compelled to list, as if needing to send some sort of signal into the ether to have the promise of receiving validation, ipso facto, from readers removed in space and time, who will finally confirm that his position in society as the other is due to something superior, some kind of a tonka dushevnost, right, that separates him from the rest. He's in exile because he feels more, he reads more, he dreams more, he has a more delicate spirituality, samay tonkay dushevnaya organizatsiya, than the rest, and he invents a theoretical other person who, probabilistically speaking, should exist, who is his romantic counterpart, and who would sit there on this bench listening to his tales of wandering St. Petersburg streets, alienated among company, without an interruption. Griboyedov's woe from wit, or Gory Utma, of course, comes to mind. Most unbelievably for an actual other, Nastenka explicitly describes the narrator's position in the friend zone. Боже, какой вы друг! Ведь мы теперь навсегда вместе, не правда ли? Most unbelievable, again, is her story about taking advantage of disabled persons. Her tale of being physically attached to her grandmother and the grandmother's blindness serving as a buffer that enabled her to pursue the entire course of romantic interest at the opera in plain sight, but thanks to the grandmother's blindness, undetected. So because, I mean, we're thinking of Laughter in the Dark here, right? Right. We would do well to remember that this is exactly the kind of third-wheeled illicit romance pursued in the dark of blindness in the book of Laughter in the Dark, where a married husband's lack of eyesight enables a couple to live a titillating and illicit romance right in front of his blind eyes and under the same roof, including even in the theater, just as in this story. Nabokov will reincarnate this unbelievable tryst between Nastenka and her fiancé into 20th century Germany fascist. Into 20th century fascist Germany. Even her very name signals solipsism and the abject, as it's repeated in this Humbert-Humbert-esque manner by the narrator and always in its diminutive form. It is always Nastenka. In Russian, this sound is almost like wall from stenka. Nastenka, stenka, Nastenka is the narrator's approaching of the limit of the stenka, of the stena, of his own objection as a way of seeking reconciliation. So, does Humbert have his precedent in the narrator of The Dreamer? When it comes to the structure of the story of Lolita, at least the answer is not ambiguously yes. What is the difference here between the abjector and voyeur? For example, Humbert looking in on tennis games, or Jeffries looking in rear window, looking out at others. For the voyeur, the desire is located in the other. The pleasure is received from the drawing in, sucking in solipsistically, objectifiedly, of an exterior object of desire into one's interior world. And the abject is quite the opposite. So according to Kristeva, all abjection is, in fact, a recognition of the fundamental lack of all being, meaning, language, and desire. So where we can think of voyeurism as a positive fictional construction, положительное, the desire stapled onto exterior objects, abjection looks a lot more like Christian mysticism, otherwise known as hesychasm. To attain catharsis and to cure oneself of the feeling of an exile within their own social sphere, a negation of the self must be accomplished. In medieval Bulgarian, Kristeva's native hesychasm of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, this was accomplished via chanting, later a prayer such as Otche Nos, repeated again and again until the ego disappears and a meditative non-existence is restored. I'll leave us with a reference to something similar that is presented as the much more peaceful cure to the spasm of abjection. And this is Kurosawa Kiyoshi's cure, where the missionary Mamiya's task is precisely to wander the world and impart the practice of hypnoticism, right? The practice of chanting repetitive sounds, this time from a phonograph, into his victims. Or are they victims? All subjects Mamiya finds are suffering profound alienation from modernity and achieving Mamiya's special form of hesychasm. They're finally cured of their anxieties, existing but feeling no abjection nor estrangement due to the total submission to the state. White Knights fall short of this, actual transcendent practice. But the narrator does leave us with the line that now they will forever be together with Nastenka, won't they? And what does this mean? Well, in White Knights, we find evidence that Dostoevsky is actually playing with his own feeling of estrangement and exile, and he seeks to reconcile his own spasm of abjection by bestowing affections to this exteriorized tulpa in the form of the spectre Nastenka, an other gendered personality with a remarkable similarity to himself that he constructs in his confession/reminiscence in order to be able to tell her inside his reverie a reverie about his reveries. While Julia Kristeva's rumination on the exile and notions of the abject arose out of her being a stranger on foreign soil, we can see that Dostoevsky's feeling of estrangement were generated out of something quite different. I posit that this is a fundamental component of modernism, born of our highly specialized, individuated, post-industrialized world that has lost the collective sacred, lost subjects with a capital S, and especially highly literate ones that find themselves in a highly individuated silos of knowledge, feel the most alienated from fellow man. The narrator in White Knight seeks to reconcile his difference and feeling of estrangement from fellow man by theorizing a female other who is actually the manifestation of his own inner judge. Through her, Dostoevsky is able to approach catharsis by reconciling his own inner judge with an entity he views as his better self, a post-identity disorder moment analogous to the ending of Fight Club's reconciliation between the narrator and Tyler Durden via Durden's murder. But Dostoevsky shows us that such drastic measures are not necessary. That is why Nastenka must disappear at the end of the story, rather than accompanying the narrator into the sunset. Ever self-aware, Dostoevsky both lets us know that Nastenka will always be with him, but also that she, and by extension he, is fine. Это слезы, это просохнет. Что вы думаете, что я сгублю себя, что я утоплюсь? These are tears, these will dry. What do you think, that I'll now drown myself and commit suicide, she says? No, right? By acknowledging it openly, Dostoevsky shows us the ludicrousness of such drastic solutions. Ending one's life in response to this objection is silly. So much the better to feel the spasm of objection to the fullest and convert it into love. So much the better to hope for this love being out there somewhere more perfect than oneself. I wanted to present the possibility here that there's a strong chance that post-romantic fictionality was present even while the 19th century's cult of verity was in full swing. And to what extent was Dostoevsky's White Knights a sentimental novel that is a novel that enabled Dostoevsky catharsis through reconciling his own objection and aversion to himself? I argue to the fullest extent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we are going to, Sarah is going to briefly respond to the first two papers, and I'll also briefly respond. And then after that, or actually maybe already, Katya, if you could open the chat so that people can ask questions in the chat, and also later unmute themselves if they have questions to ask. So, Sarah.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to all four of our speakers for some really stimulating papers and ideas. So I'm commenting, as Kate said, on the first two papers, and I'll keep this brief. Fiona Bell's wonderful paper on slapstick really captures, I think, the significance of that feeling of ridiculousness of Raskolnikov as he is murdering the pawnbroker. And she develops a highly persuasive interpretation of the zany, clownish and pathetic aspects of the novel that are all too often overlooked, perhaps precisely because they are somewhat discomforting. The relationship of slapstick to capitalist production gives that a wider significance in the novel, though I was wondering whether the slapstick associated with the works of Daniel Harms might suggest a different context for interpretation. That's a sort of completely a side issue, but I'd like to sort of raise two questions, and I should stress you don't have to answer all questions that we ask you, but two things. The first is that beyond the melodramatic elements, how does this idea of slapstick fit in with other references to performance in Crime and Punishment? And I'm thinking of all the songs and the references to the organ grinder, Katerina Ivanovna begging with her children, and so on. And that I'd like to hear a little bit about that if you have any ideas there. And secondly, does this have relevance? Does slapstick have relevance to other characters, for example, Marmeladov perhaps, or does this disappear in any other works by Dostoevsky? So my comments on Daniel's paper, this is a philosophical examination of that used Crime and Punishment's epilogue as its starting point, and like Fiona's, evokes the absurd and elucidates the complexity and paradoxes of Dostoevsky's moral world. Daniel uses the story about Abraham from the book of Genesis very effectively to disrupt our usual understanding of Raskolnikov's crimes and places them in a less stable context of Bakhtin's rejection of the idea that there is a single objective world in Dostoevsky's novels, suggesting this knife edge of faith and morality, which ultimately eludes representation. My first question for Daniel relates to how I think we're very used to seeing the Book of Job being used as a context or interpretation of Dostoevsky's works. I was very interested to whether you have any thoughts about how looking at this Abrahamic story might modify or change or add or change to that. Secondly, I'd like to ask about the victims. I was really, I thought your conclusion where you emphasize what definitely, whatever else is going on, what definitely does happen to Alyona and Lizaveta, and really highlights the fact that in the midst of Raskolnikov's psychological and emotional turmoil, we tend to think of the murders as being something that happened to Raskolnikov rather than his victims. So can your reading paradoxically give us a way out of that blind spot? So thank you.
Thanks. And shall I go next, or shall we give them the chance first? What do you think?
Why don't you
Maybe
go?
You can go and we can just collect questions.
Sure. Sounds good. Okay. So Laura's paper casts new light onto the ambiguous relationship between Ivan and Smerdiakov and the brothers Karamazov, and suggests a model whereby there are doubles in the murder of Fyodor Pavlovich, Ivan as the thinking self and Smerdiakov as the acting one, in her formulation taken from William James. Smerdiakov's epilepsy provides a structure to this relationship. Ivan is unable, she argues, to escape his culpability in the murder. So I wanted to ask you, I know that you are writing about madness more generally, something that often comes up in classes on the brothers Karamazov, which is about brain fever and Ivan's brain fever, and specifically that sort of in relation to Smerdiakov's epilepsy. Is there some kind of connection between those two states? I also wanted to ask about whether you've investigated in any way or thought about disability studies approaches to Dostoevsky. I know this is something that is coming up more and more, whether the question as to whether disability studies is a useful lens for thinking about Dostoevsky's works, whether in fact we should sort of think about our own positionality as we read about Dostoevsky's characters, and question our own response to, for instance, Smerdiakov. And then I also wanted to ask you about another epileptic, which is, of course, Prince Mushkin in Idiot, in another codependent relationship, this time with Raskolnikov and with Nastasia Filipovna. And I wonder whether you, in your work, deal with this relationship at all, and whether you think that there's any connection between Dostoevsky's epileptics. And I'm afraid I don't have too much to say in response to Anya's paper, since I only received it at the beginning of today's talk. But just a couple of things. Yeah, I think that you present a very persuasive reading of abjection as being central to the vision of the early Dostoevsky, and certainly this instability of selfhood that we see in terms of the representation of Nastasia, and also the interesting attribution of animacy to inanimate objects is very much a kind of broader feature of Dostoevsky's early works. And the double, of course, which you mention, above all, is a work about instability of self and the sort of endless question of whether or not the double is real, which is one that actually Katya and I are working on at the moment in our digital Dostoevsky project. And that's another text in which at the very beginning of the double you see inanimate objects achieving animacy. But there the question is, of course, a rather different, since we have a narrator in that work rather than it's not narrated in the first person, as the diary that you, like the diary structure of White Knights. And of course another, so I think absolutely your point about sort of abjection and the instability of self in this period when realism seems to be on the rise, and yet in its very rise there is a kind of question of the nature of reality that seems to those of us who focus more on perhaps contemporary or postmodernist literature to be something peculiarly modern, is actually, as you say, a product of modernity. And modernity, of course, is the literature of the early 19th century is very much a product of modernity. And so I also wondered whether you've thought in any way about that other problematic representations of selfhood, like Gogol's short stories, for instance, because of course abjection is probably not necessarily a word that we would use when we think about Gogol's short story narrators, but or short story protagonists. But I wonder whether there's whether that you would think along similar lines here, or if you think Dostoevsky is different. So I'll end there. So I guess should we go in chronological order? Maybe we'll start with Fiona and kind of move along, and then also just to remind the audience that if anybody has any questions, to write them in the chat, and also you can also put a Q in the chat and we can call on you to ask your question as well. Thanks.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, so much for your questions. I think you're right. There's tons of other references to performance in Crime and Punishment. I think my thoughts about performance as always being about labor in this novel is very well just epitomized by Katerina Ivanovna taking to the streets when she's left without Marmeladov to provide money. I think this like definitely deserves more study because it too, to me, is just so stupid. And I mean that in like the loving way that clown and clown studies people use the term stupid. It's like ridiculous, it's absurd, and there's something very, affecting about it. I think the other really important part that I didn't ever pay attention to until I started this project was Raskolnikov's dream after he commits the murder, where he imagines chasing a stranger back to the pawnbroker's apartment and he goes to hit her, but she's sort of bent over like a puppet. He goes down and looks at her face and sees that she's laughing. And then he tries to strike her, but it just doesn't really work. So it's this replaying of the murder where he comes to feel like maybe like a street puppeteer whose puppets have risen up against him. And Bakhtin writes about this scene, saying that, I think he says like Raskolnikov is this decrowned, like Balagan lord, or like carnival king, I think. So I see that as an important like dream text that has to be read as like the shadow of the actual murder scene. And I think that kind of speaks to Daniel's presentation as well, which I really, really enjoyed. Just again, like how are we to read the murder scene? Like in what creative world is it existing? And how does Dostoevsky position other potential meanings? And for me, the dream scene with the Raskolnikov as puppeteer is one of these other potential readings. And just really quickly, yes, there are so many other characters who have this sort of slapstick embodiment. In a larger version of this project, I trace the beginning, or one beginning, as Galyadkin in The Double. And I do think, like Anya said, the animacy of objects is like a huge trope in slapstick. So, you know, you're trying to handle an object and it ends up handling you. That's always very funny. And that happens a lot in The Double. And I argue also that Notes from the Underground is kind of this intermediary text. So we see the philosophical preoccupations that Raskolnikov will have later, but also just the same Nevsky Prospect drama and just like ridiculous embodiment that The Double has. I guess one question that I'll end with, and like maybe any of you can get back to me if you have some thoughts on this later, is something I'm trying to work out is can women's bodily degradation, like the fall, and I mean that in the sexual sense, but also in the physical sense of falling, can that ever be funny? And can it have the same slapstick meanings that it does for Dostoevsky's male characters? That's something I'm just tossing around. So thank you.
Daniel?
Okay. Thank you for your comments and questions. I would like to spend more time thinking about the connection between Abraham and Job. I think what's important, what I feel like the Job story doesn't offer is, you know, Job is himself the victim, and, you know, the sort of the theodical question, you know, theodicy, I don't know what the adjective is there, theodical questions, they don't seem like sufficient for Dostoevsky. He's not, you know, you have these, maybe it's unfair to call them helper characters, but I don't know how to characterize, but like, well, no, they're various different roles, but Sonia, Mishkin's the protagonist, I guess, so he's not a helper character, but somehow it seems like these characters, maybe Mishkin is different, but Alyosha, Sonia, some of these more unequivocally good souls who are sort of confronted with suffering all around them, her own suffering in Sonia's case, they don't somehow seem to like focalize the question of faith for Dostoevsky. You need the deranged criminal, you know, the Stavrogin or Raskolnikov or Rogozhin. I don't know how to say the Russian names, but so these are my own inventions. So it seems like the Job setup somehow to get at the real religious tension and question for him, you need to be called upon to actually transgress the ethical yourself, and not merely to somehow make sense of God in light of all the evil around. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Fear and Trembling itself and these aspects of Dostoevsky's work are endlessly puzzling, because I mean, certainly Kierkegaard and probably neither of them is willing to say you actually should or need to murder anyone to, have faith, or to prove your faith. I mean, even the idea of demonstrating your faith, it seems like it's sort of a question from, that invokes others knowing, that you telling the Abraham story and having it be an instance of faith. I don't know how that question arises in the first person, of sort of demonstrating your faith, maybe to yourself. I mean, maybe there is an aspect of, it's hard with Raskolnikov because he's not consciously thinking much about God, or at all, other than a few of his dreams and when he wants Sonia to read him the Lazarus story. It's not really part of his mental life. I mean, I think Job, the failings of the comforters is something that is closely related to Abraham, and that the big mistake religiously, maybe somehow ethically too, is to try and make sense of this. And I mean, for Kierkegaard, that's like mediating the paradox that, Abraham, he knows this, he's being tested. And, whether or not he knows that it'll be stopped, he's doing this because he knows he's being tested. That for Kierkegaard, and I think analogously for Dostoevsky, to cast it in some sort of perversely rational terms like that is wrong. It just can't be. You have to transgress it, and also somehow you have to believe that it's not. I don't know how to put it better than believe by virtue of the absurd that this isn't what you're doing. That somehow. I mean, as for the victims, I don't know. That's an open question for me. I mean, I just read the Idiot for the first time, and the end with Nastasia Filipovna. I mean, it's coming, kind of, or at least I felt like it's so heavily foreshadowed, and she seems to know it herself, maybe desire it, which is different than these two. But I don't know exactly what, obviously reading it through the Abrahamic lens, I don't know if it really brings them back to the fore. It might bury their case even further. And maybe that's just the way in which these questions of faith are unsatisfying ethically. I don't know if they are unsatisfying to me, but maybe I'm just not a man of faith, a knight of faith. So, but I don't know. I'll have to think more about the victims.
That's absolutely fine. No problem at all. Should we move on to Laura? You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm not a Zoom user. I was saying thank you for the questions and comments. So your first comment was in relation to Ivan's brain fever and how that's sort of tied into Smerdiakov's epilepsy. The thing with brain fever is that it's sort of very not a well-defined or categorized illness. It's sort of defined as some kind of issue, madness, mental, physical problem, but beyond that, it's sort of left open in the air. But I think in relation to epilepsy in particular, especially with Ivan, it's quite apparent the similarities in detaching from reality, especially with hallucinations, delusion. So for example, where he's having the conversations with the devil, do you take it as, is he literally sitting across from the devil? Would you walk in on him talking to himself like the ravings of a madman, sort of in some kind of hysteric fit, almost like you would expect to see an epileptic when they're detached from reality, when they have sort of no control over what they're seeing or hearing or doing, almost that complete lack of bodily autonomy. And also for Ivan in particular, if you take that particular episode as delusion or hallucination, then that's also linked to the demonic, especially if you take Smerdiakov as the demonic impersonation of the devil on the other end, on the receiving end of that. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a strong connection between those two. And then in relation to disability studies, it actually wasn't something I'd considered. I mean, it briefly popped up now and again, but it wasn't, in relation to my thesis, it wasn't something that a rabbit hole I could dive down, unfortunately. But that would be definitely something interesting to look into. And then with Prince Mishkin, in my work, he actually ended up in a chapter on holy fools rather than epilepsy, which was something that took quite a lot of thought to decide how to categorize and which one he fit best into. But in terms of a codependent relationship with Rogozhin and Stia Filipovna, it's definitely the same kind of vein, although not exactly in the fact that I would say they're shared as a composite character. I think they're still much more distinct, especially when you look at, say, in Hasiaika, and you can see how all three characters almost blend into one another, merge over into one another. I can't say much more on it because I separated them out, I'm afraid, but yeah, there's certainly something there.
Hanya?
Thank you. Yeah, I actually have come across questions myself regarding Gogol, but one thing that I'll know, okay, before a certain point in time in scholarship, any kind of, because of the cult, I think, of novelty, citation was viewed, like citation in writing was viewed as potentially even plagiarism. And there was this period in Soviet scholarship specifically where the double, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the double was alleged to just be a copy, a knockoff off of the nose, right, of Nos. And so I did come across that. And I think we can definitively say that the double and Nos are not the same story. But rather that it's Dostoevsky responding to the nose in the same way that, for example, Pushkin, when he was writing The Bronze Horseman, was actually responding to Mickiewicz, right, writing this poem. So in what sense do I personally find Gogol's works and Dostoevsky's works having, like, treating this concept of estrangement, abjection, and alienation differently? I find them quite different. To me, at the end of most Dostoevsky works, even in The Idiot, even in White Nights, you have this sense of rapprochement, of catharsis, right? Of something, you have this entire journey where you are able to build a location for your sense of abjection in this case, the lens that I'm looking at here, and you are able to take concrete action to address that somehow. In this case, we have the articulation of this entire reverie in White Nights, right, of the narrator sitting there and explicitly acknowledging what foolishness it is to spend his days dreaming in these fictional worlds, and having this, in my view, fictional person sit there and placate him and tell him that it's all okay, right? And then she leaves, and she'll always remain with him in his mind. And that's her point. Her point is to be there kind of as a soothing presence. And I really don't find that kind of therapy work happening in Gogol really at all. So that would be, for me, a very striking formal difference.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions from the audience. Hopefully people have a little bit more time and don't need to leave right away. And maybe we could take another 10, 15 minutes so that the audience, 3 people in the audience who have questions could ask them, if everyone's good with that. Is everyone all right for a little bit longer? Yep. Okay, great. So let's start. And the audience should be able to unmute themselves. And I see that Eric has been able to turn on his video, so it should be good. Eric.
Okay, thank you. These were all really interesting papers, but my comments really go to Fiona's talk, because I've been teaching crime and punishment, and I've just been profoundly struck by how unappreciated comedy is as an element of this novel. And I say that it's all over the place, not only slapstick, but in the language itself. Semyon Leonenko, who was on this but had to go teach, is writing this paper on some of the comedic aspects of the language of crime and punishment. But if you look at things like "on brosился stремглав на топор," right? "Он остановился и притих как мертвый," when he's just killed these 2 women. "Полицейские были довольны, что узнали, кто раздавленный." That sounds like it could be Sorokin or someone said harm. So I'd say that what you're calling slapstick is a subset of a broader element in the text, an important element, but important subset, but a subset nonetheless. Second, capitalism. I wish that, the question is, I guess, is it severable? Can you chop it off from the rest of your paper? Is slapstick of Chaplin a relative of the humor you're describing, or something born of the same economic cause? If it's the latter, as you seem to be implying, you have to go back to early Dostoevsky, you have to go back to Gogol, and Slabaya Serce, which I just reread, can be read as a hysterically funny piece. Are you reinscribing the old Marxist Soviet point about Gogol and the early Dostoevsky just on a higher level involving genre analysis? Is that something you want to do? What's the morality of comedy? Is it an ideological tool, an ideological weapon, or is it a temptation, something the reader is supposed to overcome? Does comedy make us take poverty and economic exploitation more or less seriously? I think a strong argument can be made that makes us take it less seriously. Genre in the murder scene, I would argue that it remains funny throughout, but on a higher level, because once you realize that it's melodrama or the Gothic, you realize how inappropriate those moments are. He's just killed these 2 women, right? And yet he's in the position of the Gothic heroine. And then finally, you made a comment towards the end about Dostoevsky perhaps not being in on the joke. And you might push that more seriously. In the epilogue, for instance, Raskolnikov picks up the Bible on Zyal Yio Mashinalna. Is that a residue of the comedy, or proof that comedy has been evacuated, or Dostoevsky's inability to leave this adverb behind so that comedically it kind of trails after him, holding on to him even after he wants to be done with it? And actually, really finally, if you want to hang on to capitalism, and I don't think you have to, but if you want to hang on to capitalism, it may not be the economics in the text that are important, but the economics that produce the text. And so one of the things about slapstick, of course, is inappropriate speed at which things happen. And Dostoevsky constantly complained about the speed at which he had to write. And And you could argue that the funniest character, if you want to look at it this way, if you read, the descriptions of Dostoevsky, his wife's accounts, his own letters, is Dostoevsky as a slapstick writer forced to write at a speed that's beyond the speed that anyone should ever have to write. And at one point he says, if Turgenev or Tolstoy had to write like this, I can't remember what would happen to them. But so anyway, I'm kind of resistant to capitalism as the explanation, but I think if you hold on to it, you can kind of bring it up to a different level than the one you have.
Thank you so much. I just wrote down all of your great phrasings of some of these ideas, and your own contributions. I have thought about Dostoevsky as slapstick in his own way. And one thing that someone has said in like pretty old Dostoevsky criticism is his tendency to pace while composing is the same pacing that Raskolnikov himself does. So this like manic physicality is giving rise to the manic physicalities of his characters. So I think that certainly is important. And I do agree that as I develop this, I do find capitalism is super important in slapstick theory. I think, the way that I ground this work in its like fuller version is by looking at Dostoevsky as theater goer, looking at the sort of like theatrical vocabulary that he had access to and the ways in which those performance modes were certainly underwritten by their economic context. But I understand your hesitancy, and I think like all of my readers have brought that hesitancy. Why keep it? I think there is like important work being done now on like really trying to pinpoint the exact economic processes that have so long been ignored by Dostoevsky scholars because of this insistence on taking him on kind of a metaphysical level. So I think I am interested in this like historical materialist line of inquiry, but I think you're right, just like remaining open to letting the capitalism argument change shape and be kind of flexible with it. I guess in terms of the morality of comedy and like, is comedy a temptation that we ought to overcome? Thinking about the novel as like a set of tests, just like God tests Abraham. I don't know. I think that in Slavic studies in general, like we need to do a lot more of taking comedy seriously. And kind of understanding that the writers themselves sometimes did take comedy seriously. And just I guess to finish, I loved Chloe's comment about Turgenev, Tolstoy fainting. And part of what I did for this project is actually look at those reflexive verbs that you mentioned, Eric, that your colleague was looking at, like бросился, рвался, с места. These just occur so frequently in Dostoevsky. And I did kind of like a very bad, like unskilled digital humanities project of like trying to look at reflexive verb instances in Dostoevsky, Gogol, Turgenev, Tolstoy to see like how do those other like more ruling class writers have their characters move. Sorry, Daniel. So like, рвался с места, like he like tore himself from his place. And the other one, бросился, is like he threw himself. So kind of treating like the actor treating himself as an object, like throwing yourself. And I think this is a very, it's interesting for like slapstick comedy studies, but it's also really important to thinking about on the sentence level, like what words and constructions are these canonical Russian authors of different classes and economic constraints using. Thank you.
Hi, so next question is Chloe.
Thanks for these really great papers. It was a lot of fun to see you all in person after reading some of your essays in the grad contest. So yeah, this was great. So this is a question for everybody or for anybody who wants to answer it. I've been thinking a lot recently about sort of how we use Dostoevsky now or don't use Dostoevsky now and his incredible malleability. And because of that, as I listen to your papers, I'm struck that you each take quite a strong kind of external lens, whether it's disciplinary or another literary form or mode, or another time, as in the case of Anya's paper. And so I'm just curious if you want to comment. For one thing, how do you motivate these lenses, right? Do you find them kind of within Dostoevsky's work, that there's a kind of invitation, right, to read him through later 19th century psychology or through Kierkegaardian theology, through slapstick, through modern isolation sociology, right, et cetera, or through Kristeva alternatively? Or is it more a question of kind of later intellectual paradigms that we sort of need after the fact to read Dostoevsky? And if so, why do we need them? And in general, what becomes the status of all of your very interesting close textual readings, right? How does that interact with these external lenses that each of your papers are bringing to these books?
Would anybody like to respond to Chloe's question? Yeah, Daniel.
I mean, I don't know if this is a very useful answer, but I mean, I guess reading Crime and Punishment or reading any Dostoevsky, I'm always struck by the combination of he's such a tremendous psychologist, and you don't really find insights like his anywhere else. I don't know, maybe in Nietzsche or Freud or a few, but at the same time, the novels don't really read like, they're not exactly realism. They're not somehow it's hard to place the psychologies. You don't really feel like the motive, or at least reading it, like I don't totally believe that this particular person, Raskolnikov, even though he's illuminated in this incredible fashion, would really commit this murder in this way and go on to do all the things he does. And I mean, I think there's different versions of that sense in all the novels. So I was, really trying to make sense of, what is the point of the psychology if these aren't really meant to be taken on mimetic face value? And I mean, I don't know if Dostoevsky read Kierkegaard. He could have, probably. No Kierkegaard for him. But I mean, it seemed like they were picking up the representation, the limitations of representation for Dostoevsky. It did feel like are arising from a kind of the same perplexity that troubles Kierkegaard with like indirect communication. And, if you're such a committed anti-rationalist about faith, how do you really say anything helpful about theology? How do you even go about doing that? And I mean, you could, sometimes as I was doing it, I think I tried to gesture at the end, like, I'm always bothered when I get obsessed with a philosophical reading, like you end up distorting the text. I mean, obviously Raskolnikov is not Abraham. So I don't know. I always want to write the paper and then say at the end, just disregard everything I said, but keep it in the background.
Anya.
I would say I don't really see it as being positioned externally. Maybe this is solipsistic reading slightly, Instead, it seems to me that the works that I choose to handle are all connected by this like thread. So rather than, because of the chronology, I think of it in the inverse, right? Where to me, it seems that there's an affinity here. Even as Kostieva is writing about abjection, in the back of her mind, there's Dostoevsky somewhere. You see what I mean? And so, or for example, if as I'm talking about Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Cure, like I know that in Japan, the second most popular literature is Russian literature, right? So maybe I need to like more thoroughly kind of justify that, like very explicitly in the paper, so it doesn't seem like it's external, but to me, it's very internal to the works that I choose to incorporate.
Yeah, not intended as a challenge, really, just a question.
Maybe we'll move to Peter's questions, and then afterwards, if anybody else wants to say anything else, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Gosh, I'm glad I came. Because I did hesitate, not because the program was unattractive, but because I'm recovering from a rather nasty accident and can't afford to spend too much time at the computer. And in half an hour, I have an hour and a half's meeting in Chinese. So, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Maybe I could start with Anya, so going against chronological order. I mean, you're absolutely right. Nastyenka is a figment of the narrator's imagination. That has hardly been noticed by in the critical literature, but that's largely because the critical literature is so appalling. Anna Akhmatova noticed this point, but it was just noted en passant. She doesn't argue for it. She just puts that down as an observation. Then it was picked up, I think, in sort of the first decade of the 21st century by a little-known American scholar writing in a fairly obscure journal. He also makes that point quite emphatically, but his argument is very sketchy and he doesn't really pay due attention to the text. His article is also simply too short for that. I have an article coming out, hopefully, because it's now still stuck in peer review, in Russian literature, I hope in spring, in which I show that this is the case by close reading of the text. So I can only suggest that as a possible point to look at. Fiona, you too struck a chord with me, because what you're saying about Raskolnikov, what you're saying about the murder scene, is exactly what I've been saying for a long time, that the whole thing is preposterous. I mean, there he goes to all this trouble to get hold of an axe, with all the attendant risk involved in stealing the axe and then having to return it. And the only explanation the narrator gives is that he felt he didn't have the strength to use a knife. Now, come on. I don't know whether you've ever wielded an axe, but an axe is an incredibly heavy implement. You require a huge amount of strength to use an axe. You require next to no strength to knife somebody, or to kill somebody with a knife. I mean, look at the key scene in Puccini's Tosca, where Tosca knifes Scarpio, and it's entirely believable, and is of course the the action that then triggers the conflict or the tragedy at the end. So our credulity is being strained to a maximum here. The question is, what's going on? And I think to fully understand that is going to involve a reassessment of a huge amount of early 19th century Russian literature, which has simply been misread, starting with the later Pushkin, through Gogol, right through to the early Dostoevsky, not just white knights, but also poor folk. I wanted to write about poor folk, but I found that I couldn't because I had to go back to Gogol's Overcoat. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. So all I can say is at the moment, you're absolutely right. Don't feel uncomfortable about it. You're spot on. The question is it best dealt with in terms of slapstick comedy, or you know, what exactly are we meant to do with that in narrative terms? But I don't want to say any more at this point.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I think that we need to start wrapping things up. Would anybody like to respond to Peter before we finish?
Very quickly, what was the name of that American scholar, Professor Butler?
His name, it just escapes me at the moment. It's in my article, but since I didn't know you were going to mention this point, I haven't got my article open. No. But I can send you the reference if we can find some way of making contact.
Yeah, maybe, and if you could put your email in the chat, maybe that would be an easy way.
Yeah, and then I'll send you that reference. And in that particular article, he also refers to Anna Akhmatova and her sort of passing comment. Okay, I see your email, so I'll send you the reference.
Thank you.
And as I say, I'm hoping that Russian literature will finally get my article through peer review. They've got a huge backlog, which they say is due to COVID. I'm not sure whether I believe them.
I think every review, every journal at the moment has a massive backlog because people just don't have the time to do peer review. Every journal
that seems to be the case.
Late.
Apparently, they lost 2 peer reviewers, and so now they're looking. Yeah. They assure me that peer review will be done this year.
Okay.
And so I'm hoping that the article can come out in spring or so, but maybe I'm too optimistic.
Oh, okay, so maybe we'll finish here. Thanks ever so much to all our 4 presenters for 4 absolutely fantastic papers. Thanks ever so much, Sarah. Thanks to Chloe also for being on the and to others for being on the graduate essay competition that kind of helped to bring our attention to at least to Fiona's and to Daniel's papers. And please, everybody, thanks so much for supporting NADS. Please continue to do so. And again, just to remind everybody that NADS is very happy to co-sponsor, to co-host any talks on Dostoevsky. So if anything is going on and you would like us to Zoom host, if you'd like to invite somebody to your institution, all we need to do a talk is another institution to co-host with us. So thanks, everybody, and hope to see you all in person one of these days soon. Some of you, hopefully, next week in Chicago. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.